is an interview with Robert Litterman, an economist and investor focused on risk, incentives, and climate policy. In this conversation, he discusses a proposed carbon-linked bond idea, an approach inspired by inflation-linked bonds like TIPS, and how it could help create credible, market-based expectations for future carbon pricing. You can read more about Robert Litterman on our website, 6degrees.blog, and our Instagram page, 6 Degrees Away. Thank you, and enjoy the interview.
How should we think about countries with historically weak governance or low credibility whose debt investors may avoid entirely, whether carbon linked or conventional?
Yeah, I mean, it's a credit problem. So one of the countries that reached out to me and said they might be interested in issuing such a bond was Bhutan, that I just came back from. And they would love to issue the bond, but they don't have a credit rating. They can't issue a bond, So they would have to get some sort of credit support. So for instance, the World Bank has issued a number of, or it's not really issued, but it's provided the credit backing for a variety of sustainability linked bonds. It's really then the World Bank that's issuing the bond. It's the World Bank credit that's guaranteeing payments from the bond, but the payments themselves are linked to outcomes in the issuing country.
Mhm. So, how does the policy avoid imposing higher energy costs on consumers immediately after implementation? Which I know you've addressed, but
I'm not sure how it avoids. The whole idea is to create appropriate incentives to reduce emissions, to price in those externalities. If what you're suggesting is, it might be more politically appropriate to ease those in over time, is that the
no.
case?
So how would it not? So let's say you create the bond, wouldn't energy costs for consumers increase rapidly?
Depends how the bond is structured.
Mhm.
These bonds that I'm talking about, carbon-linked bonds,
Mhm.
they promise a carbon price. Uh,
Mhm.
The actual price is a function of the structure of the bond.
Mhm.
So you could have a price that starts low and increases over time, or you could have a price that jumps up to a high value immediately, reflecting the actual externality.
Mhm.
What are you trying to get at there? I mean,
Meaning no, nothing particular, just how would the countries implement it in a way that wouldn't sort of shock the system?
well, I'm not sure shocking the system is a bad
No,
thing.
yeah, of course. No, but just in a way where everyday consumers would be more open to it. They would still be able to survive using the things that they have without, I don't know.
In Bhutan, there's very little consumption of fossil fuel.
Hmm.
So that's an example where I don't think it's really a big issue. But I guess the answer to your question is that the government could set any particular targeted path that it wants.
Hmm.
In the carbon linked bond that I have proposed,
Yeah.
that's part of the design of the bond is to say, here's a targeted carbon price path. So I can make that anything I want. I
Hmm.
could make it immediately jump to a level that is appropriate, the social cost of carbon, or I could say let's phase it in over 5 years or 10 years. That's a decision that a government could make based on, I suppose, political considerations, but it's not part of the design, that's required to be there.
Hmm.
Does that
So
make sense?
yeah, makes sense. In terms of just they can choose however much they want to change the
Right.
pricing.
Yeah.
Um, so how do you expect elections and changes of administration to interact with this instrument? And do you see the mainly as a way for one government to lock in a carbon price path for its successors or something that needs cross-party buy-in?
Yeah, no, it's a great question. I think of it a lot like a Federal Reserve policy, right? It's a similar structure to TIPS, Treasury Inflation Protected Securities. And the beauty of these real return bonds, among other things, is that they do reveal what the market expects for future inflation. And if you're a policymaker like the Fed, that's very useful because you can react to that future expectation. When it gets too high, then you can say, all right, we're going to tighten policy. We have a targeted inflation rate, 2%. And when, the expected inflation gets way above 2%, we better react. If we don't react, we're going to lose credibility, right? So it's the same idea here. The government sets a price path. It then gets feedback from the market as to whether the market trusts that it's going to hit its target. And if the market doesn't, it can, take actions that create expectations that it will hit the target. Actions such as tightening up whatever, in this case, increasing policies that are going to create incentives to reduce emissions, i.e. the carbon price. You have to define what you mean by a carbon price. You haven't asked about that, but that's a little bit tricky, I suppose.
The carbon price. So I sent you the little thing. Carbon prices within the seven policies. That's how it's calculated. So if for viewers, I guess if I'm posting this, could you contextualize how the carbon price is calculated? What is the carbon price?
Yeah, a carbon price is an incentive to reduce emissions. And so it's not well defined. It could be a carbon tax, it could be an emissions trading system. These both create marginal incentives to reduce emissions. And that's kind of what we mean by a carbon price. Now, there's other policies, things like, the ETS is a policy that creates an incentive to reduce emissions, but a tax on fossil fuels, if you don't have a tax on electric vehicles, then a gasoline tax is a marginal incentive to reduce emissions by creating an incentive to use a clean vehicle. But you could think of, for instance, a payment for carbon sequestration. If it's permanent sequestration of carbon, that's also a carbon price. And so, what do we mean by sequestration of carbon dioxide? I guess the way I think about it is to be very clear. We're talking about incentives that will reduce the flow of emissions into the atmosphere, or incentives to pull emissions permanently out of the atmosphere. And that's how I think of carbon prices. So if you want to measure them, you want to think about the average of all the payments that governments either receive for emissions that are emitted into the atmosphere or pay for emissions that are sequestered out of the atmosphere. And, if you want to think about emissions into the atmosphere, have a very long lifetime, essentially permanent. And so in order to be an opposite, it would have to be a permanent sequestration of carbon out of the atmosphere. So it gets a little tricky when you talk about, temporary reductions, like often are created with offsets. They're not necessarily permanent. So they're not really the opposite of an emission.
So when you say permanently get carbon out of the atmosphere, what exactly do you mean by that?
Well, yeah, what do we mean by permanent? Certainly if the carbon dioxide becomes dissolved in rocks, that's pretty permanent. On the other hand, if it's sequestered by trees that might burn in a wildfire or, decay over time, that's not permanent. If you have a forest that's in equilibrium, now there's no forests that are in equilibrium anymore because the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere has gone up. So on average, there's CO2 that's being incorporated into trees. But in the long run equilibrium, you would expect the same amount of carbon dioxide to come out of trees as going into trees, other than, maybe permanent burial or, some small fraction. but anyway, so permanence is something that we could define, but something over 100 years is how most people think about it.
Mhm. And do you think it matters where in the cycle governments actually price carbon? Whereas if you're actually at the gas station and you're taxed at the pump versus if the company's taxed on site?
I'm not sure I understand when you say, does it matter?
I mean, do you think it makes a large difference within the model whether, I mean, how the composition of the carbon price is, if that sort of makes sense?
No, I'm not sure what you're asking, and so it's hard to answer. But if ultimately the price to the consumer goes up,
Mhm.
gasoline goes up $1 a gallon, then how would that matter to the consumer? And how we achieve that increase in price, does it matter whether we start at the wellhead
Yeah.
or at the gasoline station? I, I don't think it matters.
Mhm.
Who would it matter to?
Yeah, just generally, I don't. I was thinking it didn't matter, except maybe you had some sort of answer better. It's better to price it in one way versus the another.
Well, it might be easier to price it at the wellhead. There aren't that many wellheads that you have to worry about. So that would be probably the right place to do it just because it's cheaper. But it doesn't matter to the ultimate consumer how the government, collects those revenues.
Hmm. So, if a government is consistently missing its carbon price targets and paying higher coupons as a result, what kind of political pressure do you think that creates domestically? Is it pressure towards more likely to push towards tightening climate policy or trying to dismantle the instrument as a whole? Is sort of what I'm.
Dismantle okay, the government has said we're going to price carbon at $100 a ton.
Hmm.
Okay, now you're saying suppose the bond reflects an expectation that it's not going to hit that target, or do you say, are you talking about we've actually gotten to that date and now we're measuring the price and lo and behold, it's not where we said it was going to be? I'm not sure what the
No,
question
so
is.
the government, let's say they consistently are missing their targets and paying a higher coupon. How would the how would it work where the government wouldn't just end up saying, okay, we're going to dismantle the carbon bond as a whole just because I don't know, it's been sort of a.
Well, you're entering into in issuing a bond, you're entering into a contract where you're promising to pay, and in this context, according to a certain formula. So now we're getting to the date, and I promised it was going to be $100 a ton, but it's only $80 a ton, and therefore I pay a higher coupon, right?
Mhm. Yes.
So, the buyer of the bond, if they were hedging a risk that they wouldn't get, paid, let's say I'm in the business of sequestering carbon, and I think, and the government has promised they're going to pay me $100 a ton to sequester carbon,
Hmm.
and they're only paying $80 a ton.
Hmm.
Well, I've hedged my risk by buying the bond, and
Hmm.
now I'm getting paid a higher coupon. You could calculate how much, how many bonds I would have to buy,
Hmm.
or, what typically happens is that I actually enter into a derivative contract that's priced based on where the bond is trading. And so now I go to my counterparty and I say, well, the bond's only $80 a ton, so you owe me this much money.
Hmm.
And that has hedged the risk that, the payments from the government weren't the $100 that they promised. It's only $80 a ton.
Hmm.
So now I've hedged my risk. And, that. So what was, remind
So
me,
I guess
what,
I guess the question was a little confusing, but what your answer sort of helped contextualize a little bit. So now to sort of move on from that, so the model appears to work best when governments and investors participate, when a lot of governments and investors participate rather than just a few early adopters. So how can the world realistically overcome the coordination problem so that carbon-linked bonds don't remain a small corner of sovereign debt market, of the sovereign debt market?
Well, it's a little bit like, again, I just use the tips as an example. They're not a huge part of but they're a liquid market. So they provide a forward expectation of inflation, a measure, a market, measure of expected inflation. And in this context, the bond would provide a market expectation of future carbon pricing. Now, that's critically important because the essence of the climate problem is that we're not moving fast enough away from the pollution created by fossil fuels. We're not investing enough in low carbon infrastructure and capital. And so how do we speed up that investment? Governments only have so much money to invest, and nonprofits only have so much money to invest. We can't expect those to increase dramatically. And we need a dramatic increase in the amount of investment. So where that has got to come from is the private sector. And what will drive the amount of investment in the private sector are expectations of getting compensated for those investments, that they will be profitable. And so what will create that investment is the forward price expectation of carbon. If investors expect higher, compensation for clean energy, they're going to invest more. So bottom line is we have to increase the expectations of forward pricing of carbon. That's what's going to drive that investment. So the whole idea of the carbon linked bond is to focus on those expectations and try to get them where they ought to be.
Mhm. So, as someone who's obviously created the bond and been with it for a long time, what do you see as the largest problems with the mechanism?
Well, I didn't create the bond. All I
Or,
did was write about, how the idea of tips could be extended to carbon.
Mhm.
And the more general problem is how do we increase expectations of compensation for reducing emissions and sequestering carbon. And one obvious approach, because it works in the general inflation market, is tips. And so how can you make a tweak to that would reveal the expected future price of sequestering or reducing carbon emissions? And that's the idea. So how do you create a forward market in carbon? And there's different ways one could do it, but one way would be just to, tweak the tips approach. That's what I wrote about. Yeah.
Mhm. But so, what do you see as the largest problem within that? And also, how do you see this actually being implemented in reality? In terms of what are the steps moving forward to seeing it going from maybe one state to the country to other countries, things like that?
Yeah, I mean, so who's going to issue the bond, I suppose? And you would want a country that's actually committed to reducing carbon. So the EU obviously has already created carbon pricing through its emissions trading system. They could do it. Anyone, it's got to be a government that's committed to pricing carbon and credible, a credible government. So the hardest part is finding an issuer who would be interested in doing it, I suppose.
Mhm. Okay, thank you so much for your time in terms of the questions. It seems like it was a little confusing in terms of what I was talking about for why the carbon bond would be a game theory item. If
Yeah, well, I just didn't see it.
Yeah, the reason why I thought about it in a game theory context, and also the questions seemed like they weren't very good. Except I swear I did research the topic. I do know the model. But so McAdams' whole approach is he has a book called Game Changer. So his whole idea is to change the game. So I thought this was the ultimate changing the game, where right now we're in a lower equilibrium where investors don't have the incentive to invest and governments don't have the credibility to incentivize them. So then it provides a regulation, which he writes about in the book. Or regulation doesn't necessarily mean like a government body regulating, but just a sort of mechanism that allows for something to be more guaranteed, which is exactly what this is. So then it changes the game to a better equilibrium in which governments gain this credibility and they can have this new bond and investors, and obviously pricing in carbon to the social
I
price.
I can see that. I mean, I don't know much about game theory, but maybe you think about the Fed and how it's trying to create expectations of low inflation going forward, and maybe that's a game with the public or a game
Mhm.
with the often people think about the monetary authority and the fiscal authority as having, kind of a game going between each other and, you
Mhm.
know, so yeah, there's probably a number of ways of thinking about it from a game theory perspective. I haven't thought about it that way, but probably in terms of the Fed, or in this context, the government itself trying to create credibility and potentially locking in, future governments. So one of the issues that a lot of people think about is, we put on a carbon tax and then the Republicans come in and they get rid of it, and then the Democrats come in and they put it back on. And so, how do you get rid of that back and forth amongst different political parties? So that's clearly some sort of game theory problem, and maybe this kind of bond would, in some sense, lock in future governments. Although, I could imagine a world in which a new government comes in and they just say, no, we're not going to price carbon, and then okay, they have to pay a little bit more, and so that, but it's hard to imagine that the amount more that they would pay from the bond is really going to prevent them from changing policy. It does set up that incentive, but you'd have to have it maybe, and that's what you're suggesting, you'd have to have an awful lot of these bonds and a certain degree of responsiveness for that incentive to be strong enough.
Mhm.
You put it another way, the government should have an incentive to do the right thing anyway. So
Mhm.
if it's going to do the wrong thing, the fact that that's going to cost it a little bit more, okay, yeah, I suppose that's a good thing. But
Mhm.
uh, but it's hard to say it's going to be determinative.
Another reason why I like the idea so much and I wanted to write about this specifically is I talked to lots of activists and all kinds of things like diabetes and financial like overtrading within different brokers and just lots of random things like that. And oftentimes their answer, they say they have a proposition of this would be so much better if the world was like this, and then I say, okay, how would the world get there? They say, oh, just sort of it would. Like there would be people would be kind and this better thing would happen. Robin Hood would give away they wouldn't be trying to make as much money as they wanted. So they're just living in a sort of, I don't know, world that I don't see could realistically happen. Whereas this is trying to create a mechanism where it really incentivizes people to actually have this idea come about, besides obviously the effects of climate and wanting to be a good person.
Right, right, right. This is an attempt to use financial engineering in a productive way to allow governments to create credible promises to pay for carbon sequestration or to charge for carbon emissions. And that's what we need. Those expectations will generate the private sector investments designed to create profits for for the investors, and
Mhm.
entrepreneurs will think about, how can we sequester carbon? And I'm going to think a lot more about it if I can lock in $100 a ton,
Mhm.
5 years from now than if I can't. And really, I think ultimately the problem is today no one expects, globally harmonized
Mhm.
carbon pricing at appropriate levels anytime soon. I mean, I don't know what appropriate levels are, but they're a lot. We should have strong incentives to reduce emissions, and we don't. And how do we change that? How do we change those expectations? And because we don't have those expectations of these strong incentives, we're under investing dramatically, and therefore the transition is much too slow. It just seems like the issue is all one of creating those expectations. put another way, everyone knows that we should be doing it, but it's a
Yeah.
political problem. And how do we, get over those politics?
Mhm.
That's tough, but this was one thought as to how you do that.
Yeah, that's why I thought it was such a good game theory model, where it's something that would be so much better for everybody, all parties included, except it's just not getting there because of a few political problems, as you said, in terms of free rider and tragedy commons, things like that.
Exactly. But that's why, to me, this coalition of countries coming together is so exciting. That's a way of actually getting there. Then, once they've agreed that they're all going to price carbon, issuing the carbon linked bond is kind of an interesting and obvious thing to do. But you've already agreed you're going to do the carbon pricing. That's the hard part.